The word trauma gets used in so many different ways, it can leave you unsure where your story fits. Let's clear that up. Hi, I'm Allie Christie Disney, and I work with driven, high-achieving women. And for a lot of women, especially high achievers who've built their success on being able to keep it all together and keep pushing when things get hard, the word trauma can feel uncomfortable. Calling an experience traumatic might feel like it's too over the top, too dramatic, too victim-y, or even like a waste of time. Like, why would I want to focus on all that past pain? Thinking about it will just drag me down. And yet, we still carry stuff, some pain, some unresolved from the past. And so we might wonder, does my story count as trauma? So let's dive in. Part of the confusion is that the word trauma doesn't just have one definition. In psychology and psychiatry, the most widely used definition comes from the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that clinicians use for diagnosing mental health conditions. And in that book, trauma is described in relation to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and very specific types of events like life-threatening accidents, combat, sexual assault, natural disasters. And those views focus on whether or not you were exposed to a clear event and developed specific responses, such as flashback, nightmares. And those definitions can be really helpful in like medical research settings, but unfortunately that definition doesn't capture the whole range of experience that people have. So another framework is complex trauma, which interestingly is not even in the DSM, but that many therapists and researchers use to describe what happens when stress or harm is repeated over time. This might look like growing up in an unpredictable home, living with ongoing neglect, or being in relationships where your safety or worth was constantly undermined. It's less about one single event and more about how your nervous system responds and parts of self adapt to long-term survival. Then you have body-based perspectives like somatic experiencing, which say that trauma is a stuck stress response pattern, fight, flight, freeze, and how that impacts your nervous system and how that dysregulation impacts your life. This highlights how the body carries unfinished survival responses, a racing heart, being on high alert, shutting down, freezing, even long after the event is over. So another definition of trauma you might have heard of is the big T's and the little t's. Big T trauma, little t trauma. And big T refers to those major life-changing events, like an accident or assault, whereas little t in this definition points to smaller, repeated hurts, like a moment of dismissal, rejection, or humiliation that on their own might not seem huge, but over time really leave a deep imprint. And if that isn't enough, another trauma definition option for you is some therapists talk about type A or type B trauma. Type A is described as painful experiences of lack or neglect, like what was missing in your life, like not feeling safe, seen, or cared for. Whereas type B describes painful experiences of harm, what shouldn't have happened but did, like abuse, accidents, or violence. So with so many different definitions, it's easy to feel confused. Like, which one is right? How do I know where my experience lands? And in my work, I use a perspective that I first learned from one of my somatic experiencing trainers and have since expanded on. And that perspective changes the definition of trauma from something that happened, an event or experience, to the individual's response to that event or experience. And you may ask why. Like, why does that individual reaction matter more than the event itself? And for that, I have two answers. First off, we regularly see that an event that someone would consider traumatic can have one person walking away fairly unscathed. They're not bothered, they're not having intrusive thoughts, they're not having a long-term impact on their view of themselves. And then you'll have another person who experienced that same event and they're having flashbacks, nightmares, be completely paralyzed because of that same event. Or on the converse, something benign or small seems to happen to somebody, like an insult or criticism from your boss. and that can be incredibly painful, whereas somebody else can just brush it off. And if what mattered in the definition of trauma was all about the event, then this difference is really hard to explain. And secondly, having the definition of trauma be primarily about the category of events or experiences tends to miss or invalidate experiences where people have real, legitimate trauma responses, but those events do not obviously fit into a category of trauma listed or named. It creates these like fake lines around pain and suffering and leaves us invalidating our own pain, other people's pain, because we think, well, surely an insult or a snide comment from my coworker that sent me into a panic spiral isn't as dramatic or as valid as my friend who was held at gunpoint. But in reality, until you dig deeper, you have no idea how that experience interacts with an individual, their ability to resource, and their other life experiences. And this is why it's important to have a definition based on impact. While there are, of course, common shared experiences of events that people experience as traumatic, like abuse, neglect, assault, trauma is more about the lasting impact of pain on a person and their nervous system, and not about the defined event in and of itself. So, with all of that said, here's my official definition. Trauma is the ongoing, lasting impact of a painful or distressing experience that occurs in a person when an individual's ability to resource is overwhelmed or outmatched by the disturbance of the experience. In a separate video, I go into detail to explain what it means to resource and what constitutes a trauma reaction and the specifics around why and how trauma is created and also healed. And I'll link that in the description below. But the summary takeaway of all those details is that trauma occurs when at the time of a painful event, a person doesn't have the tools on board or around them so that the pain gets resourced and moved through, and thus it gets stuck. It gets experienced as a trauma. So if trauma is defined by our experience, by our body and emotions reactions to an experience rather than being defined by the event itself, then the important questions are less about what happened and more about how that event impacted you. And often when we're asking, does my pain count as trauma, we're really asking something deeper. And that is what I'm feeling valid? Does it make sense that I'm hurting this much? And in my work, spending literally thousands of hours sitting with clients and all the different parts of them impacted by past painful experiences and traumas, I know this without a doubt. I've never met a part that didn't make sense. Every reaction, every feeling, every way of coping has its logic. And even if that's not clear to you right now and your pain and reactions make sense. You make sense, and you do not need a perfect label for your story to matter. So if you're experiencing lasting disturbance or pain from an event in the past, then that counts as trauma, and more importantly, it is deserving of space and healing. So if you've been wrestling with this question and want support in making sense of your story and healing some of those traumatic experiences, I'd love to invite you to visit my website, alliechristycounseling.com, and learn more about therapy intensives where we can do that healing together. No matter how you choose to heal, your experience matters, and you don't have to wait until it fits one exact definition to begin healing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.